Hey, welcome back. Today, let's step away from the more esoteric philosophical sorts of considerations and talk about something more practical, the rules that surround the use of names in zoology. We all use names every day. They're a vital part of our means of communication with one another. And so we want to look at how we give animals names in today's video. So, a couple of things come to mind whenever I think about names. One is the quote from Romeo and Juliet of Juliet, "What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet." And to note that one, I've pulled a little movie poster from, I would guess that's probably 1940s maybe, production of Romeo and Juliet, the movie. Who do we have there? We've got Vincent Price. You probably remember Vincent Price from the old horror flicks, right? And also Vincent is confronting Basil Rathbone, who I'm sure you guys are all too young to remember that Basil Rathbone starred in a series of movies in the 1940s in which he played the role of Sherlock Holmes, with Nigel Bruce playing Dr. Watson. Anyway, that's an old-timey reference. Talking of old-timey, how about this Confucian saying? That's purportedly an image of Confucius below, although Confucius lived so long ago, I don't believe there are any first-hand images of him. In Chinese, there's lots of sayings, adages that take this form of 4 characters, so 4 syllables. And let's see if I can pronounce this one. It's Mingzheng Yanshun, which you probably have heard in its more anglicized version, tend to be a lot more wordy than the succinct Chinese. Something along the lines of, to know something well, you must call it by its correct name. So that first character, Ming, means name. So we're going to talk about names that are applied to organisms. So the rules, I forgot to capitalize that. That's okay. There are a set of rules that are supposed to be followed that govern the formation and the use and adjudicates the disagreements over the uses of names. And this set of rules is known as the International Code of Zoological Nomenclature, which you'll often see abbreviated as ICZN. The ICZN, well, first of all, its scope is restricted to animals. So the ICZN does not govern the use of names in viruses or bacteria or plants. But there is one area where there's a little bit of ambiguity, and that is in protists, so single-cell eukaryotic organisms. If they are photosynthetic, then they are governed by the Code of Botanical Nomenclature. If they are not photosynthetic, they're governed by the Code of Zoological Nomenclature, which gets a little bit confusing when you have protists that can be, in some parts of their life cycle, photosynthetic and other parts not. But I don't have to worry about that, so I'm not gonna dwell on it. So that's the ICZN. That's a set of rules. It was devised, well, the earliest stages started to appear in the early 19th century, so the early 1800s. But it was only toward the end of the 19th century that these rules started to be codified, pulled together, the different sets of rules that had been developed to be reconciled and then adopted by the larger zoological community. Officially, these rules are written for and then are going to be voted on internationally at the International Congress of Zoology, which is largely not much of a thing anymore, since we've all become so specialized that having a Congress devoted to animals in all their aspects, not only all kinds of animals, but physiology, genomics, systematics, everything, would just be so crazy that it's really kind of an outmoded means of voting on this. You can actually go read the International Code of Zoological Nomenclature if you are a glutton for punishment. It's online at www.iczn.org. The ICZN used to be headquartered in London, and one of my friends was the executive, what do they call him? The executive secretary of the ICZN for a period of time. It's now, because of the, it takes money to run these kinds of organizations, and it was just, there was not enough money to continue to run it in London, and so it has been transported to Singapore now, where the ICZN Secretariat is located. What the long-term solution for its home is yet to be determined. The people who make up now let me rephrase that. The people who implement the ICZN are known as the Commission, and unfortunately it has the same initials, ICZN. So you sometimes have to specify when you say ICZN whether you're talking about the code or the Commission. Let's see. I've kind of bounced around these points here, haven't I? The code is actually published in two parallel, equally authoritative versions, one in French and one in English, which you can understand that the objective of doing that, remember, we're talking about these things were developed in the very late 19th century and very early 20th century. So French was, I suppose it still is, widely used as a language of diplomacy. And so the objective of writing it in both French and English and having them be equally authoritative, the idea was to get it out to the widest community around the world as possible. The problem is that even though these are officially sanctioned translations, sometimes it comes up that a set of words in English does not mean the same set of things in French. And this whole area of the rules of zoological nomenclature will probably end up reminding you very much of the law profession, in that these are a set of regulations for how to do something. And if there's a career to be made parsing very finely the meaning of words in the law or the Constitution, the same is true here. And we have some of our colleagues that are deeply, deeply steeped in the arcane minutiae of the International Code of Zoological Nomenclature, and kind of revel in that as their own little bailiwick of expertise. I don't want to belittle the people who serve on the International Commission. This is an unpaid position. These people do it out of their sense of duty and their sense of responsibility to their field, because controlling how names are used, or at least restricting to some extent the way in which names are used to certain paths, is absolutely essential if we're going to be able to use names in order to effectively communicate with one another. So this is a picture taken a few years back. Let me grab my other laser pointer here, of the International Commission on Zoological Nomenclature. There are a number of entomologists in the group. Let's see. I don't know all of these people, but this gentleman right here is Dennis Brothers. Dennis is at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, and he is an expert on mutilid wasps. So what's the common name? Velvet ants is the common name of mutilid wasp. Who else do we have here? This gentleman here with the mustache. This is Thomas Pape, who is a Diptera specialist in flies. He's I believe he's now in Stockholm, and he has been in Copenhagen. He may actually split his time between the two places there. Let's see, who else do we have here? An entomologist. This gentleman in the back with the glasses. You may know him. That's Doug Yanaga, who is the curator of the insect collection at UC Riverside. So Doug is a boy. He's got a lot of things. He's a hymenopterist. he has done a lot of work on bees, but he also early in his career did a lot of work on cerambycid beetles, longhorn beetles, and so he's got a lot of talents, a lot of expertise. The other entomologist I recognize is this chap here in the far right hand side. That's Frank Torsten Krell, who is now at the what do they call it, the Denver Museum. Frank came to Denver originally from, well, not originally, but he came to Denver directly from the Natural History Museum in London, but he actually got his training in Germany. So Frank has a nice German accent. He's a specialist on scarab beetles, and he seems to be the only one who's wearing an entomologically or a taxonomically themed t-shirt in this. Well, maybe Daphne here. This is Daphne Foten, who is not a fish expert. Daphne is now retired. She worked on sea anemones, and one of her students, Meg Daly, is now in the Department of EEOB. Who do I recognize? Oh, of course, one other person I want to point out here is Rich Pyle. Here, Rich is a fish taxonomist. He works for the Bishop Museum in Honolulu, and is a world-class diver and does lots of diving to collect the fishes and work on their systematics. Rich is also very deeply involved in computerization and the use, the leveraging of databases in order to facilitate the process of nomenclature. I'm sure there's some others here that I'm overlooking that I should know, but that's all I have for right now. So let's move on. It's the commission. So the goals of both the code and the commission, I guess, can be stated in very general terms. The first is that we would like every organism and every group of organisms that we choose to give a name to in our within the scope of the code. We'll get more into that in a little bit here. But we would like every taxon to have a name. And not only that, one unique, valid name. So that if I talk about, what's a good example? If I talk about formicity, then you may pronounce it differently, formicidi, whatever, but that is the name that refers to the taxon that goes under the common name of ants, of course. So the goal is to have every taxon with a single valid name. If more than one name has been proposed for the same group of organisms, then you make the choice between them on the basis of what's called the principle of priority. That is, whichever name was first officially proposed, and there's of course a whole set of rules about what that means, we'll get to. Whatever name was first proposed is the name to be used, and all the other ones are invalid names. So we want a unique name for everybody. But we also want stability. We don't want names to be changing, every generation, or even less than every generation. So we want names to be stable. Once a name has been proposed, then that is the name applied to that group of organisms from here on in. And then not so much a goal, but a basic working principle, I think, is that the Commission believes, and the code states explicitly many times, that its purpose is not to get in the middle of disputes about relationships among organisms or how to classify things. The code's scope is strictly with how you apply names to the things that you discover in the process of science. So they espouse total taxonomic freedom. They do not put any restrictions on what a scientist can produce. It's only involved in applying of names to these hypotheses, theories that are produced through the sciences of taxonomy and systematics. So let's see how we effect these goals. So the first thing we need to talk about is what does it take in order to have a name officially, the jargon is available. That is a name that has met all the rules such that it is considered to be the valid name applied to a taxon. If, for example, it's the first time any name has been applied to that taxon. So we call this availability. What does it take for a name to be available under the ICZN? So there's many sections in the code that apply to this, and this is a distillation of those criteria. First of all, the proposed name must be actually published for the scientific record. What do I mean by that? We'll get into definition of publishing in just a second. But for the scientific record, I mean that, sometimes people will throw out and say, I found this weird, something to this essence. Obviously, in an article, you'd have more highfalutin language. But I found this strange thing that's bright yellow, whereas most of the individuals of what I think this is are black. So I'm going to call this the flavus form of that species, as a shorthand to refer to this yellow form. Flavus in Latin means yellow. If someone says it like that, such that they're explicitly saying, I'm just using this as a shorthand term for something I observed, or sometimes people will even say, this name is not to be considered an official proposal of a taxonomic name, then that name is not that word, name, phrase, whatever they use in order to talk about these organisms they're interested in. That name is not available, no matter if the rest of the criteria are in fact met. Also, this the requirement that the proposal be published means that things like records in field notebooks or identification labels put on specimens in museums or anything of that sort that is not officially published are not available, and we don't have to worry about them. So what does it mean to be published? When the code was first developed, of course, what publication meant was the traditional hard copy sort of publications. So in books, which is what until probably the middle of the 19th century is the place where most new names were published. But then we had the advent of scientific journals coming out. And so these periodicals were also hard copy. So traditionally, the definition of publication meant that it had to occur in print. And more than that it had to occur in multiple identical copies, so not just one-off, multiple identical copies that were available. Well, I guess I'm being redundant here. Instead of available, let me say multiple identical copies that a person could acquire. So it wasn't something that was restricted. The general scientific world had to have some kind of access to these publications. Now that leaves a world of gray areas in terms of things like rare books and limited print editions. So it was largely left unspecified how many copies had to be available, and if there were any restriction, what kind of restrictions could be placed on those copies, which by and large we've now, I think, moved beyond. So while the early editions of the code, we're now in the 4th edition of the code. Earlier editions spent a lot of time worrying about things like how many copies and such. In these days of electronic publications are not so critical. The code traditionally also, as new technologies became available and it started to appear like, wow, it's going to be too easy to publish things, the writers of the code, with the approval of the International Zoological Community, specified that photocopying did not constitute publication. So you couldn't jot something down on a piece of paper and make 50 copies and send it to all your buddies. That wouldn't count as publication. Same with mimeos. You guys probably don't even know what mimeos are anymore. It was the predecessor of photocopies. And for some reason, they balked at the idea of compact discs, CDs, serving as a mode of publication. Well, of course, the world has moved on in the last 20, 30 years to many, many different forms of publications, such that hard copy publications may not be there yet, but we're not far from the position where those are the exception rather than the rule. So recently, the code has been amended to allow for electronic publication to be acceptable if a permanent physical archive is maintained somewhere. And typically, I think the rule of thumb now is that a journal that is primarily in electronic format, the publisher would produce a small number of copies, 5 maybe, and then distribute them to major museums around the world, the British Library, Smithsonian, a couple of places, so that in the event of a massive computer failure where all these electronic publications suddenly disappear into the thin air, if you will, that there's something to fall back upon in order to document these publications. A couple of interesting aspects of the definition of publication in the ICZN, and things that just blow colleagues away in other fields. I mentioned the first one, that peer review is not required, which many people just think is unimaginable, and it has led to some pretty severe dust-ups in certain fields. There are certain groups of organisms that are very popular, and I'm specifically thinking of reptiles here. And there are certain individuals in the herpetological world who have quite, let's call them unorthodox ideas about classification and naming of organisms. And they have published their work in the face of the rest of the herpetological world, which is going off on a different tangent. And there's a big dust up, and it's continuing ongoing. I see no resolution other than a bill of attainder, basically, to stop these people from publishing, because they're doing shoddy work. But peer review is not required. And the other aspect that also plays a role in this whole herpetological problem, but I've seen it many places in the insect world as well, is that it's allowable for you to privately publish a book or journal, and that, as long as you meet the requirement that you produce multiple identical copies and people have some way of getting their hands on them, you donate a set to those 5 libraries again, then that, under the code, is perfectly acceptable, which of course opens a huge Pandora's box for people to do shoddy work, write it up in a very poor fashion, and publish it without any peer review by paying, you could pay Amazon to publish a book for you, and that would meet the criteria of availability, or at least the criterion of having been published in order to be available under the code. There's certainly a lot of work that still needs to be done in the Code of Zoological Nomenclature in order to tighten up these sorts of loopholes that could just wreak havoc on the naming system of all the organisms in the world. So more on availability. It has to be published. The name has to be published. And you have to provide, well, I'm going to call it a description, and then kind of tell you what a description is you have to provide a description for the organism to which you are applying this name. The definition of a description now is very loose. Remember, the code does not want to get into issues of taxonomic freedom of thought. So it only mandates that you provide provide characters, and perhaps you can get away with one character, but provides characters by which the authors purport to distinguish this new taxon from the others. You can see the loopholes here. It doesn't say how many characters you have to provide. It doesn't say how detailed, how comprehensive, how painstaking the description has to be produced, as long as it's there. It doesn't say that it actually has to distinguish the new taxon, only that the authors purport that they do distinguish the new taxon. So I mean, I've seen papers published where the author says this is a species that, of all the other species that I know, is different by having red antennae. Well, that appeals to the author's level of knowledge, or conversely, their level of ignorance of what other taxa there are that this thing might be confused with. But as long as the author states or implies that these characters distinguish the new taxon, that's all that's required in terms of meeting the requirement for a description. Yeah, this is as good a time as any. This has recently come to the fore just this year with the publication of a monograph in the journal Zookeys, so in which the authors describe over 400 new species based solely on a picture of the animal, a side view of the animal, and a DNA barcode sequence. And there's a bit of an uproar about this because they don't bother telling you how to distinguish this one species from the other ones that had been described in the 250 plus years prior. They just say, well, those things aren't identifiable because there's lots of cryptic species going on here, and you can really only distinguish them by means of their DNA sequences. So we'll just give the DNA sequence a picture and give it a name and purport that that meets the criterion of availability. A lot of people don't like this, and I don't know if the ICZN is going to be able to, or will be even interested in doing anything about it. Of course, it's like a court of law where we don't call them lawsuits, but somebody's got to bring this case to the ICZN. I don't think they're going to go seeking it on their own. Anyway, continuing with the criteria for availability, the name that you proposed has to use the Roman alphabet. So no Chinese characters, no Hindi characters, no Arabic characters, anything like that. And in the name, this is a place where the rules have changed. But today, the letters in the name cannot have any diacritical marks. So umlauts, accents of various sorts, tildes, the sharpest S from German, or anything like that. Those are all not allowed. There is a loophole in which you can use a dash in a name. I forget which genus this comes from. I think it's a ichneummonid wasp, where it's called something. Let's call the genus Dibubliomactus W-album. And what that literally means, if you translate from the Latin, is that this creature has a white W shape somewhere on its body. And that's a loophole where you can actually use a non-pronounceable character in the name, and in the name validly. I guess that raises the point. Many people struggle with pronunciation of scientific names, and in part that's due to a lack of familiarity with the pronunciation of Latin or Latinized Greek words. So there's a level of ignorance that might make it difficult to pronounce names, because they can be complicated. It can be darn complicated, especially some of these names that I've encountered in mites. But it's also possible, to concoct a name that is unpronounceable under any circumstances. For example, if you had a name comprised of the letters WXY, WXZ, let's say, no vowels in there. How do you say that? That would not be considered to be a valid name. That the name has to be at least theoretically pronounceable. Maybe this is a good time to mention also that there really is no correct pronunciation of names. People across the world with different backgrounds in their own languages pronounce these names differently. So even though we strive to have unique, universal names for organisms to facilitate communication, when that communication is oral, our accents and the way we interpret letters can get in the way. Just in the family that we work on, the Celionidae, it's spelled S-C-E-L. So let's see. My Australian buddies pronounce it Scelionidae. I pronounce it Celionidae. My Italian friend pronounced it Scelionidae. So that all of those are correct. There's no regulation on how a name should be pronounced, but only that its representation in print is the same. You can pronounce it any way you want. And that also leads to the point that the name that is used, the terminology is that it should be Latin or treated as Latin. In the very early days, of course, many names were taken directly from the Latin, and we still concoct names from Latin. So some understanding of Latin vocabulary, Latin grammar, not to mention a Latin dictionary, can be helpful if you have to come up with a name. But there are now oodles of examples in which people take words from other languages. Perhaps they have to transliterate them, or in other languages that don't have alphabets, Chinese, for example, to Latinize them, use the Latin alphabet, I mean, in this case. But then that word has to be treated as if it were a valid Latin word. Latin scholars get their shorts in a bunch here because many people without familiarity with classical languages break the rules of Latin grammar all the time, and they think it's their job in the world to correct all of these ignorant people. The code does not allow for that. The code does, with one small exception. Well, it's not so small, but with one exception that I'll get to. The code doesn't care if you have good or bad Latin. This is one of the things that led to a proliferation of name changes in the 19th century, where somebody would propose a name and somebody else would read it and say, Arnold didn't know anything about the Latin language. What he should have written was this, and supposedly correct it. No more corrections allowed, with one exception. And then finally, and I'm not going to dwell on this right here, but one other criterion for availability is that a type is designated, and I'll explain what types are in just a few minutes. I'm postponing a discussion of what types are because types are different things in different contexts, and the context I'm referring to are categories of names. The code, the ICZN, divides names into 3 different categories, and these are names that refer to species group taxa, a term to be defined shortly, names that are referred to genus group taxa, and names that are referred to family group taxa. So let's go through each of these one by one to talk about how we come up with names and what the rules are governing the formation and use of names in each of these categories. So let's start out with species group names. The scope of species group names are names that are applied to, as you might guess, species or subspecies, and that's it. If you look at the older literature, and I am sorry to say even the modern literature on occasion, you see lots of subdivisions of species or subspecies that people use, and they go by millions of different names. Some of the more common ones you'll see are varieties or forms, or not morphe, but morph. Must have had apomorphy on the mind when I typed that. Variety, morph, form, aberration, stirps. The list goes on and on and on and on. These are called infra-subspecific ranks because purportedly what you're talking about is subdivisions of subspecies. We didn't talk about what a subspecies actually is defined as when we talked about species. And of course the code under the mantle of taxonomic freedom of thought does not define what you should think of subspecies is, but typically in modern systematics, a subspecies is a geographical subset of a species. So it is geographically defined, and of course it's got to be different in some aspect, or you would never think of giving it a separate name anyway. But that geographical business. So you can't have two subspecies that are sympatric. There's also a concept of something called a superspecies that typically refers to a group of closely related species, and maybe indistinguishable, but not necessarily so, but just something to say this is a group of species within this genus without going to the point of coming up with a new genus or something for it. The point being, though, that infra-subspecific names and superspecies are not considered to be species group names, and so the rules of the International Code of Zoological Nomenclature do not apply to them. Okay, first, use of the word type for a species group name. So I'll say this, then explain it. The type of a species group name is a specimen. Now, I am using type in a non-standard, at least in terms of normal English or German or any language, use of the word. Usually we would think of a type as a kind of thing. Or if we say something is typical, we kind of think of, well, if that's typical of the honeybee, then we can expect it to have this character and this character, this character. It has a waggle dance and it does all these things. So I want to first disavow any connection between the nomenclatural use of the word type and the idea of typicalness. In fact, our use of the word type in modern times is very different philosophically from why we use why that word started to be used in the first place in the 19th or 18th century. What we mean today in terms of a type, or in the case of a species group name, a type specimen, is that this is something that is intended to link the intellectual concept of a name to reality. And the way it works is that you propose a name, and you propose this specimen shall serve as the type specimen for that name. That means that whatever species or subspecies, whatever species this specimen belongs to, you can't see it, but I'm holding a specimen between my fingers. Whatever species this specimen belongs to, it's that name that goes with that species, because that's the type specimen. The name is forever linked to that type specimen, and whatever taxon that type specimen belongs, the name goes with it. So this is how we know which names to apply to which taxa. We basically start out on a taxonomic study, the scientific end of it now, dividing up our little microcosm into different species. Then we go look at the types. This type, Dibubliomoctus flavipes, belongs to my concept of this species. And so now my concept of this species is called Dibubliomoctus flavipes. Dibubliomoctus, by the way, is a genus name. tongue-in-cheek genus name that my advisor always used when he wanted to talk about taxonomic issues without coming up with real taxa and potentially confusing the situation. So anyway, the name linked to that type specimen, and whatever species group taxon that type specimen belongs to, the name belongs to that taxon. So here's just a set of labels. Just wanted to show you an example from a whole. I'll explain that in a second too. From a type specimen, let's restrict it to that for now. The species is called Grion rothi, described by Lubomir Masner. It is a female specimen. We've just pulled the labels off. The specimen does still exist. And here's all the normal sort of collecting data. This is a unique identifier that supposedly, if we go to and put this number, this code, and this human readable string should be exactly the same thing, just different. You can scan this and get it entered in the computer more easily. Typically, how shall I say this? Usually, type specimens are noticeably labeled, and red is a common color to make it stand out in a collection. It wouldn't stand out so much in the Taiwan Agricultural Research Institute collection that I visited, because instead of having all their locality labels on white paper, they're orange. I don't know why they made that choice. But commonly people use red labels for these types so that you can identify them. And these are critical because this is now the international standard to tell you which species that name needs to be applied to. Okay, that label said holotype, right? So this gets us into the rat's nest of types of types. So the first thing I want to distinguish is between primary and secondary types. The primary type is the important one. The primary type is that specimen that the name is forever linked to. Now, when an author describes a new species, let's say, and designates a specimen as the type, and puts that bright red label on it, that specimen is then known as the holotype, the true type, if you will. It's also possible, especially from stuff in the olden days, where if an author described a new species on the basis of a single specimen, then that is also considered to be a holotype, because we know exactly which specimen he either chose or the only specimen that he had reference to. So that's the holotype. That's the gold standard. But back in the old days, as our concept of how we're going to use types evolved in taxonomy, it was not unusual for authors to say, well, this specimen and this one and this one and this one and this one, these are the types. You know, not put any prefix on it to specify which one is the holotype. Just say these are the types. So these under the code all have equal value as primary types. And in order to clarify, I mean, but it's also possible that there's more than one species there, that the author made a mistake, or not necessarily made a mistake, but as we've learned more, we've discovered, oh, what looked like one species is actually, 4 species. And in this series of syntype specimens, or just this type specimen series, you've got 3 of them. So which taxon should this name go with? In those instances of confusion, then what we need to do is to go into that original series of multiple types, syntypes, meaning that they're all types, and select one that matches the original description. Is, people do make errors, so it matches it as close as possible. Matches the way we've been using the name in our ignorance of the problem that there's more than one species hiding under that name, and designate that one to serve the same role that the holotype would under normal circumstances. That kind of type is called a lectotype. And so that is also a primary type. It's the functional equivalent of a holotype, just that it was designated later by somebody else. Well, it could have been the same author, but just at some later time. Now, it does happen on occasion that these invaluable primary type specimens, they might get destroyed. And so under those circumstances, there is a provision in the code to allow you to designate a new specimen to serve as the type. And for that reason, that's called a neotype. So in terms of nomenclatural or nomenclatorial, I've learned that both are correct. In terms of nomenclatural importance, it's the primary types that are the important ones, because those are the ones that tell you how to correctly apply names. And there's different flavors of them, but they're all serving the same purpose. But then these are primary types, so that begs the question, there must be secondary types, right? Oops, there we go. So secondary types are basically an author describes a new species, selects one specimen to serve as the holotype. All of the other specimens that he or she used in coming up with the concept of this species are secondary types, or what are called paratypes. These have no nomenclatural status. People tend to think of them as being important because while it might be difficult to get access to the holotype, if the author's work was done well, and there's no multiple species hiding under that same name, then these secondary types, or what are called paratypes, will give you an idea that goes beyond the words in the publication, or perhaps even an illustration in the publication. And it lets you look at new characters that the author had no idea about or weren't illustrated very well in the original publication. So, they have some practical value. Ultimately, though, a good taxonomist wants to see those primary types in order to make sure. And in the same way, so remember back in the definition of lectotype, where you had an original syntype series, you selected one specimen to serve as the primary type, that's called the lectotype. Well, all the rest of those syntypes now become what are called paralectotypes, and you can understand from the name what that means. There's also another term, well actually there's a whole bunch of other ones, but another very common type of type that you'll encounter in the literature, and that's something called the allotype. Well, first of all, let's state that the allotype has no nomenclatural status other than it's just another paratype. Its distinction is that, for many years, an author would designate a type in a bisexual species. Of course, that type can only be one sex, and so if it's a female, but the males have characteristics too that the author thought was important, he or she could designate a specimen of the opposite sex of the holotype as the allotype. This is now, well, people still do it, I hate to say, but it has no nomenclatural significance, and really no scientific significance either. If the males and females have different characters, you're describing them in your taxonomic work, and so there's really no point in specifying one individual specimen to be the representative of the opposite sex of the holotype for this species. But you'll see that, so I wanted you to make sure that you knew what that was. Okay, so names for species group taxa. As you all know, beginning with the 10th edition of Systema Naturae by Linnaeus, the names of organisms, of species, have been in the form of two names, actually. Let's put it this way. A name is formed from two words. Sometimes you'll see this called binomial nomenclature. I think more accurately it should be called binominal nomenclature, because a species name is composed of two elements. One is the name of the genus to which it's applied, and the second is what's called a species epithet. It's not a curse word, but a second name. So starting with Linnaeus, we use binominal nomenclature in order to give names to species. So every species name consists of two words. This was first consistently applied across all animals by Linnaeus in the 10th edition of Systema Naturae in 1758. Actually, there's one little quirk that may come in handy on entomological trivia night if that exists anywhere, and that is the nomenclature for spiders actually does not begin with Linnaeus, but with a work published a year earlier on the spiders of Switzerland by Clerc in 1757. So that's a little trivia tidbit for you to store away. But these are the official starting points for nomenclature. All the names that were used before are ignored. In fact, well, I can show you. This is a page from the 10th edition of Systema Naturae. What I was about to say, in fact, Linnaeus often, insofar he was capable, gave a literature reference to where a name had been used before, or at least a reference to that species had been made before. Daguerre may have used two names. He may have used a genus name and a long phrase to describe, what is this, Ichneumon subcutaneous here. But this is a page from Systema Naturae. Let's focus on, this is one of my species right here. Species of the group I study, I should say. It's a Linnaeus species. This was originally described as Ichneumon ovulorum. Oh, I didn't mention this. Today, the standard enshrined in the ICZN is that a species name, the two words, the genus name has a capital letter to start it. The species epithet is always lowercase. So what you're seeing here with this capital O on ovulorum is really the old style. It's still used in botany, I believe, but no longer in zoology. So the species epithet should always be entirely in lowercase. And so what Linnaeus has done here, so here's the name. This is number 66 in the genus Ichneumon, and this is a species description. Species descriptions don't have to be, even under modern ICZN regulations, don't have to be pages and pages and pages long. It could be just this short, but what is he saying here? He's saying this is a black ichneumon, so niger means black, with red legs and long filiform antennae, so long thread-like antennae. Daguerre talked about this thing in volume 1, page 35. How does this go? 1, 35, and then I think these are figures here, 11, 12, and 13. And then a little bit about its biology. And sometimes, yeah, here we have, do we have any? Sometimes he gives the geographic distribution. He does not seem to do that in any of these that are visible here, but he says the habitat in the eggs of Lepidoptera. So these are one of these little egg parasitoid wasps that attack Lepidoptera. And if you want to go peruse the 10th edition of Systema Naturae, you can go to the Biodiversity Heritage Library and look that up and look through it to your heart's content. It's basically the first biodiversity database. All the names, the descriptions, literature references. Look, he's got several literature references here. You have to be able to unpack the abbreviations, and then the biology, and sometimes the geographic distribution as well. So let's talk about these specific epithets a little bit, because you're probably a little bit confused about what's going on there, because there are rules that govern them. And unfortunately, we also will eventually have to invoke some of the rules of Latin grammar, a bugaboo for many people. Anyway, so the epithets can take several different forms. They can be a noun. So for example, the wasp Microgaster flavipes. What flavipes means, I mean, and it has a literal meaning. It means yellow legs. The name doesn't have to be actually true. So don't read too much into that, but that's, it's nice to have a name that is mnemonic, that tells you something about the species so that you can remember it, rather than just having arbitrary combinations of letters that don't actually mean anything. In a similar way, the epithet Telenomus ovulorum. Ovulorum means from eggs. So this is in the nominative, here we go with the Latin grammar, the nominative case, that is the case that you would use for a subject of a noun in the acting as a subject. And this is in the genitive case. So literally means it means from or of eggs, and eggs is plural, ovulorum. So then an epithet can be a noun. An epithet can be an adjective, such as microgaster flavus. This simply means the yellow microgaster. You can see the root flav here, there, and the pes means legs in that example. But this just means yellow. It can also be a participle. That is an adjective formed from a verb, such as microgaster serratus, curled. I'm not sure what is curled on them. Maybe the ovipositor sheaths or something like that. As I said, the name you give doesn't have to be actually accurate. And in many cases, people will name species after the places where it was collected. So you may collect a microgaster floridanus in Florida, and then find that, oh, that was mislabeled. It's really from California. Well, too late, buddy. It's called floridanus. You can't change the name to Californicus at this point. Little pet peeve here. Although practically all journals, there are some exceptions, but many journals require that when you first use a species name in a publication, it must be accompanied by the name of the author, and even some journals by the date when the author published that name. Author names and dates are not, I underline not, pound on the table, not part of the name of the organism. They are like a microbibliographic reference tagged on to the end to help you know who described that species. So I've grown to accept that this is a windmill. It's not worth tilting at any longer. So you're gonna most journals, most entomological journals, are going to require that you have the author name. It may be difficult to figure out who the author was, so beware. You'll also see a convention in zoological nomenclature that the author name is sometimes enclosed in parentheses. Here's an example there at the bottom: Telenomus ovulorum Linnaeus, with Linnaeus's name in the parentheses. What this means is that Linnaeus was the original describer of this species, but when he did that, he did not put this species in the genus that it's presently placed in, the present combination Telenomus. You actually saw in the last slide that when Linnaeus described the species, he put it in the genus Ichneumon. So he indicates this by putting it in parentheses. Again, this is how do I put it kindly? This is worthless. But people, this is a tradition that has been followed for literally hundreds of years, and although it should be tossed in the dustbin of history, it's still out there. So just so you know, when you see this formulation, that means that this species was originally described in a different genus. But beware, the botanists do it differently. Okay, that's all I wanted to cover in terms of species group taxa. Let's move on to genus group taxa. The ranks to which the rules around the rules around the names for genus group taxa, there we go, apply only to things placed as a genus or as a subgenus. All a subgenus is a subset of the species within a genus. So genus group taxa also have types, but in this case the type is not a specimen but a species. So a genus will have a type species. That type species, of course, will have a type specimen. So we always eventually have recourse to an actual physical specimen in order to compare where we want to use this name to where we should use the name. In its form, a genus name is a singular noun, a noun in the singular, always capitalized. And this noun has grammatical gender. Now, I didn't talk about this in species because the way that we apply grammatical gender to specific epithets depends upon the grammatical gender of the genus in which that species is placed. So if your specific epithet, well, I'll first say that what I mean by grammatical gender is that a noun in many, let's think a second, probably, I'm reluctant to say all, but let's say the vast majority of Indo-European languages, a noun can be masculine, it can be feminine, or it can be neuter in gender. These have nothing necessarily to do with true sexual gender of the things to which that noun might point. You know, you could say woman refers to someone of the female sex, but that does not mean in a language in which that word is used that the word also has feminine gender. Not always the case. I just learned that the word Colleen in Irish, which means girl, is actually masculine in gender. Go figure. These things don't have to make sense. Often don't. So those are the three possible genders. If you've taken French or Spanish, you're familiar, or any Romance language, and you're familiar with masculine and feminine. You get into German or Russian or something like that, you also get neuter gender there. So, and in Latin there are three genders. So we have to confront this, and we hope that we know what the gender is of the genus group name that whoever described that genus in the first place gave to it. Don't always, and sometimes that's a point of confusion. Why is it a point of confusion? Because if the specific epithets applied to the species are either adjectives or participles, then those have to agree in gender with the genus name. If it's a noun, no problem. Nouns don't change. But if it's an adjective or participle, it must agree. So the example I pulled out, and here's one that is commonly wrong in the literature. The eastern tent caterpillar belongs to the genus Malacosoma. In Latin, the word soma, meaning body, is neuter in gender. And so the proper name of the eastern tent caterpillar is Malacosoma americanum, with the um on the end here, indicating that this adjective is in the neuter. This is the neuter form of that adjective. Let's put it that way. So very often you'll see in the older literature, because you got an a here and a here, and if you learned Spanish and you're applying those rules, then you would think this is feminine. So we need the feminine form of the adjective here. But you're going to get misled here, because soma is actually neuter. So it takes a bit of knowledge of Latin sometimes, or Greek, because a lot of these words are Greek words that are transliterated in the Latin alphabet and then treated as a Latin word. It gets confusing, and there's confusion in the literature, and that's one of the things that make people pull their hair out about nomenclature, and what has given rise to many people to abandon it. For example, the Lepidoptera community has basically said, I don't care what the ICZN mandates, we're going to ignore gender agreement between specific epithets and genus group names. They haven't been called on that yet. You'll often see that genus group names are abbreviated in the literature, just having the first initial. So in that case of Malacosoma americanum, you might just have M. americanum. That's very common. It's standard that the first time you use the name, you spell it out in full. And it's also something that was beaten into my head as a graduate student as I was first writing papers, that I never begin a sentence with an abbreviation. So if I want the species name of that eastern tent caterpillar to show up as the first word in the first pair of words in a sentence, then I would spell out Malacosoma. Sometimes you'll get in situations where you're talking about species in two different genera, and both genera begin with the same letter. So sometimes you'll see with two two-letter abbreviations. So there's really no hard and fast rules there. This is just common sense. If you are using a subgenus, then a subgeneric name follows the same rules as the genus name, but except when you use it for a species, that subgenus name is interpolated between the genus and the species names in parentheses. So this is a common wood ant, Formica cerviformica fusca. So this species Fusca belongs in the subgenus Cerviformica of the genus Formica. Some people get lazy and it becomes confusing, and they sometimes will simply call this, in this example, would call it Cerviformica fusca. Don't do that. This is the genus it belongs to. This species' official name is Formica fusca. Cerviformica fusca is not its valid name. So it may, you may find people doing that, so beware. Some people will treat subgenera as genera. Again, taxonomic freedom of thought. They're free to, to treat this as a valid genus, and so it sometimes takes a little bit of digging to know whether an author thinks that, when they say Cerviformica fusca, are they just incorrectly referring to a subgenus, or do they really consider Cerviformica to be a valid genus on its own? What else do we have here? Family group taxa. So the names for family group taxa apply to taxa that are recognized from the level of superfamily down to, but not including, genus. And there are a variable number of ranks that you could include. You could go from superfamily, family, subfamily, supertribe, tribe, subtribe. There's no limit there. But anything in that range, from superfamily at the largest end to genus, but not including genus, anything in that range, they fall under the regulations associated with family group taxa. I bet you could have guessed this. The type of a family group taxon is a genus. And of course, the type of a genus is a species, and type of a species is a specimen. So again, you have that link to some concrete reality in order to figure out how to correctly apply names. In its form, family group taxa are nouns in plural. So while in English it is sorely tempting to say Formicida is a family of Hymenoptera, grammatically that would be incorrect because Formicida is plural. But it sounds horrible to say Formicida are a family because family is singular, right? So you get this well, you can reconcile this with a choice of words such as the family Formicida is in the order Hymenoptera, or prefixes something like that. But just if you want to be a stickler for the accurate details, a family group name is a plural noun. Now, for some of the ranks that come in this range from superfamily down to, but not including genus, there are standardized suffixes. Try that again. Suffixes that are applied to them. So most of the name is composed of the root of the name of the genus. Let's go to the example, because all of those are here. Here's my example. So the genus Formica is the type genus of the family Formicida, and you can see that this name is formed from Formica with the addition of the suffix idae to the end. So we have all family group, let's say that again, all names of families in animals end in idae. And if you've taken any botany, you know that they use a different suffixes for the family level. Why we can't agree, I have no idea. Tradition. Subfamilies end in the suffix inae, tribes in the suffix ini, and superfamilies in the suffix oidea. So we have Formicity, Formiciny, or Formicini. In English, it's easy. In English, it's not uncommon for these two words to be pronounced identically. So sometimes you have to adopt a bit of an affectation to distinguish, either say tribe Formicini or tribe Formicini, or some such affectation in order to make it clear what you're talking about when trying to communicate orally. And then finally, subfamily Formicoidea. So all of these names, all of these family group taxa, there are different ranks in the hierarchy. They all have the same type, the type genus Formica here. So you would think that what we do next is we talk about the names of orders and move on. But this is where the ICZN stops. All ranks in the hierarchy above the level of superfamily are outside of the scope of the code. That is, there are absolutely no rules that apply to them. So we get in the uncomfortable situation of having multiple names for the same thing. Ones you'll probably run, if you read Russian, you'll come across quite a number, because some Russian authors really go off the deep end and have different names. For example, Hymenoptera is called Vespida by some authors. But these are a couple that you'll not uncommonly encounter. Ephemerida versus Ephemeroptera. Modern days Ephemeroptera is pretty much what everybody uses, but you get into the older literature, you're going to see Ephemerida a lot. This one is still unresolved. Lots of people use Embioptera, the web spinners. The web spinner expert, there aren't very many of them, preferred the use of the word Embiodyna for that order of insects. So there's no right or wrong here, because there are no rules that apply. There might be predominance of usage is an argument you might make in order to choose between them. But even though we've got some suffixes that seem pretty common, there are no rules mandating that the name of an order of insects end in optera. None at all, or ptera. So that's the Wild West there. Okay, let's wrap up here with a couple of issues, problems that come up. The first is it's possible for one taxon to have more than one name, either because the authors who described them are ignorant of one another, or they disagreed, or science has later proved that two things that we thought were separate are the same. There's lots of reasons that we can end up with more than one name for a taxon. How do we choose between them? We apply the rule of priority. That is, the oldest name is the correctest name. We can subdivide synonyms into two types. One is objective synonyms. That is, they have the same type specimen, and for some reason, two different names have been published for that same type specimen. And then there are subjective synonyms, which is a result of knock on wood, progress in science, that two things that were originally thought to be separate have been shown to be the same taxon. And so now they had two different names, and now they refer to a single taxon. We have synonyms. So objective and subjective synonyms, again, resolved by in most cases, by the principle of priority. We'd have, conversely, the opposite problem, where we have one name that's used for two different taxa. These are homonyms. Again, priority should help us to resolve which one should be the correct name. And then the other name, we use the adjective senior and junior. So the senior homonym would be the oldest name, oldest usage of that name. And the junior homonym would be the younger one. The oldest name is retained. The senior homonym stays in use for whatever taxon it pointed to. The junior homonym needs to be replaced and you'll see these things called replacement names, or nomina nova, nomen novum in the singular. So you just have to say, look, this is a homonym. It needs a new name. I propose this. There was the genus Protellinomus that had been known since 1920s or something like that. Then a Chinese author found a fossil of this tiny little wasp, and not knowing anything about the nomenclature of the group, called it Protellinomus, meaning the first Telenomus. Well, that name had to be dropped and a new name proposed, and so he, at my urging, proposed the name Sino-Protellinomus, the Chinese Protellinomus. Perfectly, and now everything's straightened out. What isn't straightened out is that there's no coordination with the other codes of nomenclature. So, for example, the genus name Agathis refers both to a wasp and to a gigantic tree that grows in the southern hemisphere. And they're both valid. The name Euglena could either be a beetle or it could be the protist that you are probably familiar with from general biology or high school biology. There are a lot of examples of these homonyms across codes that, for the time being, we simply have to live with. And I guess the only time it's a real issue, because usually context will straighten it out, is when you do computer searches and you want to find all the literature on Euglena. Well, you're going to get a mixture. Of course, most of it's going to be the protist, not the beetle, but not so much in Agathis. You could get a good mixture of botanical and zoological literature coming back from that search. So that's where it causes some practical problems. Should this be resolved? Absolutely. Will it be resolved soon? Well, people are talking about unified codes of nomenclature, but again, you're talking about a quarter of a millennium or more of tradition. And so it's going to be a hard slog to get people to give up things that are so well entrenched in their psyches. What else do we have here? What about happens in a case where our principles of stability and priority conflict? And this is a classic example. There was a proposal. Well, you're all familiar with the common lab animal Drosophila melanogaster, right? And Drosophila systematis, we talked about all the species of Drosophila in the Hawaiian Islands, but there's many species of Drosophila all around the world. And they have refined their classification so that they use a number of different subgenera. And the problem is that Drosophila melanogaster does not belong to the subgenus Drosophila. It belongs to the genus Drosophila, but it belongs to the subgenus, where is it? Sophophora here. And so if there's been some noise in the Drosophila specialists that they want to refine this generic classification and start to recognize some of these subgeneric groups as valid genera. If they do that, then if Sophophora is considered to be a valid genus, then the name of the species that is in thousands upon thousands of publications since the early, well, it really exploded in the early 20th century with genetics, then that name is going to be changed for this common organism. So in this case, some authors suggest that it made an appeal to the International Commission on Zoological Nomenclature to change the type species of Drosophila from, Drosophila funebris, to change it to Drosophila melanogaster, so that no matter what reclassification in these flies happens in the future, melanogaster will always be in the genus Drosophila. The commission rejected the application. So sometimes our deeply held goals are going to conflict. And when that happens, an application is made to the International Commission to decide the case. And you provide their evidence, just like a lawyer's briefs and such. You don't get a chance to stand up in court and appeal your case in person and take questions, but it's very much like a court of law. So I don't know. Maybe someday there's not going to be any more Drosophila melanogaster. We're going to have to call it Sophophora melanogaster. Or maybe they'll reconsider the case. Finally, they're probably for the last 20, well, it's been up for about 20 years, but it's becoming more and more commonly used, is I think I've bemoaned this fact before, that there is no single place for you to go in order to find, well, for example, if you need to get the author's name for a species, there's no place to go. There's no single place to go for you to find out what the correct author's name for that species is. And so Zoobank is an effort that is being, well, the person on the ground that's heading it is Rich Pyler. He was the fish systematist on the commission there in Honolulu, to have an official registry. And so now the latest versions of the code specify that a new species name must be registered in Zoobank in order to meet the criteria of availability. And most journals will do this for you. I happen to have access to get in there and be able to add stuff personally, but in most cases, the editors of the journal have access and will be able to do this. So it's not an onerous thing, but ideally, eventually, we'll have a full compendium of all the names that have ever been proposed, where they were proposed, etc., in one centralized resource in order to make what is, honestly, a silly hassle about how to properly cite names in a publication, to make this very easy and straightforward. Maybe to the point where we won't need those darned author names at all. So just to quickly summarize, the way we use names in zoology is governed by the International Code of Zoological Nomenclature, the ICZN. The primary goals of the ICN are stability and uniqueness, so that every taxon has one name, and that name is different from any other name that's used for a taxon, and that name doesn't change over time. Types are what link these conceptual things, names, and our concept of what taxa are to the real world, because they manifest in a specific, ultimately in a single specimen that you can look at. And the proper application of names depends upon which of your concepts of taxa that specimen belongs to. So it kind of anchors nomenclature in the real world. And again, let me admonish you that type does not mean typical. That's common, ongoing misconception. Under the code, there are 3 categories of names: species group, genus group, and family group names, each of which have their own rules that differ a little bit here and there. And anything beyond superfamily, remember, no rules at all. You can do whatever you want. Homonyms, synonyms are resolved by priority. So whichever name was used first is the valid name, and then any other disputes or conflicts are referred to the commission. So I hope this clears up some of the things you might have seen and not really understood at the way species names are used in zoology. I'm not an expert on botanical nomenclature. I know a fair amount about zoological nomenclature, but just tell you that the botanical rules are different. I don't completely understand all of their rules. In many ways, they're quite similar, and there are efforts. There are people who would like to be able to come up with a unified code of zoological nomenclature, and I guess I can only just wish them Godspeed and good luck. So that's all for today. We'll see you next week with the next set of videos.